They thought the old Norfolk house was just another file, another widow's signature, another veteran's family too tired to fight. So they emptied it in the rain, a navy coat, a cracked photograph, a folded funeral flag, and an old UDT dive slate no one had bothered to read. Frank Walker stood there at 74, silent, gray, forgotten. Beside him, his German shepherd watched the black SUV across the street. Then a woman burst from the storm and fell against his truck, bleeding, whispering, "Help me." At first, Frank thought the men had come for the house. But when the dog locked onto the driver's door, he understood. They had come for the truth. And the old man they mocked was Little Creek Walker, one of the last frogmen. They had touched a dead man's flag in front of his son. Cold rain slicked the Norfolk curb, and the folded flag struck the water before Frank Walker could bend. The guard laughed from the porch of the old house. "That's all your family is worth now." Frank Walker did not answer. At 74, he stood a little bent through the shoulders, but not weak. His face was square and weathered, cut by deep lines around the mouth and eyes. White stubble covered his jaw. His silver hair was hidden beneath an old navy cap, darkened by rain. He wore a faded field jacket, dark jeans, and brown work boots polished more by habit than shine. His left hand moved slowly most days, but it closed fast around the edge of the wet flag. In a file somewhere, Frank was still retired U.S. Navy Senior, Chief Frank Walker. He had gone through Bud S. at Coronado, when his knees were young and his lungs could burn all day. He had served with UDT 21 at Little Creek in the 1970s, then stayed when the old UDT name changed and SEAL Team 4 carried the work forward. None of that mattered to the men from Harbor Light Veterans Trust. To them, he was an old man with a quiet voice, an aging pickup, and no one standing beside him except a dog. Ranger stood near the front tire of the truck. The German shepherd was old, 9 years at least, with a heavy black and tan coat, a gray muzzle, and one ear nicked from some earlier life. He did not bark at the guard. He watched the man's hands, then the door, then the dark SUV parked half a block away. His body stayed still, but his eyes kept working. The house had belonged to Frank's father, small, white, weather-beaten, with a sagging porch and a rusted mailbox that still carried the Walker name. That morning, Harbor Light had emptied it in the rain. A navy coat lay across the steps. A cracked photograph had slid face up into the gutter. A toolbox had split open on the sidewalk, spilling pliers, oil-black rags, brass screws, and a small slate board scratched pale from age and salt. Frank set the folded flag on the hood of his truck. He did it with both hands. Then he picked up the photograph. His thumb moved once across the wet glass, clearing the face beneath it. He looked toward the porch. The guard smiled wider. "You can file a complaint," the guard said. "Office opens Monday." Frank's jaw tightened. He looked away before the guard could see much else. His gaze dropped to the toolbox, then to the slate board lying beside a coil of wire. He picked it up. The object was no larger than a book, black once, now worn gray at the edges. An old UDT dive slate. Men had used things like it underwater when paper would have failed them. Frank turned it over in his hands. Rainwater ran across the back and filled the shallow cuts in the surface. At first, the marks looked like damage. Then his thumb stopped. The cuts were letters. "If Harbor Light comes, don't sign." Frank did not move for several seconds. The rain tapped against the slate. Ranger turned his head toward the street. Frank's fingers closed harder around the board, and the old scar across his right knuckle went white. The guard stepped down from the porch. "You hear me, old man?" Ranger shifted one paw forward. Frank placed the slate inside his jacket before the guard saw the words. Then he gathered the flag again. He did not hurry. He folded the wet plastic close against his chest and turned toward the pickup. That was when the woman came out of the rain. She ran from the side street, not straight, not steady. Her shoes slipped on the wet pavement. One hand pressed against her ribs. The other reached ahead of her, fingers spread, as if she had been running toward anything that looked solid enough to stop her fall. Mary Collins was 62, medium height, narrow through the shoulders, with silver brown hair plastered against her cheeks. Her skin was pale from cold and rain. She wore a navy raincoat over a gray cardigan, both torn near the sleeve. Her eyes were light gray, sharp even through the shock, and they did not stay on Frank. They kept going past him, down the road behind her. She hit the front corner of his truck and caught the mirror with one hand. Her knees gave, but Frank reached her before she struck the pavement. The folded flag stayed pinned between his arm and chest. The dive slate pressed hard against his ribs beneath the jacket. "Help me," she said. Frank held her by the elbow. Her coat was soaked through. Her breath came short, and a thin red line ran from her wrist into her sleeve. He looked once at the blood, once at her shoes, then at the street behind her. Ranger was already facing that way. The guard on the porch stopped smiling. A low engine sound rolled through the rain. The dark SUV at the end of the block pulled away from the curb, slow and deliberate. Its headlights came on, white against the gray morning. Mary's fingers dug into Frank's sleeve. Frank moved her behind him without looking back. The black SUV rolled forward another yard. Frank moved Mary behind him before the SUV reached the curb. The motion was small. One step, one hand guiding her back by the sleeve. His other hand stayed near the folded flag on the hood, close enough to catch it if the rain pulled it loose. Ranger stood ahead of the truck now, not in the street, not on the sidewalk, but exactly between both. The SUV stopped, with its headlights burning through the rain. The engine kept running. For 2 seconds, no door opened. Frank watched the windshield, then the side mirrors, then the front passenger window, where a shoulder shifted behind tinted glass. Mary's fingers closed around the back of his jacket. Her grip was uneven, tight, then tighter. The driver's door opened first. Richard Vale stepped out as if the curb belonged to him. He was in his late 50s, tall and narrow through the frame, with a clean-shaven face drawn in sharp lines. His silver hair was combed back and untouched by the rain for one brief moment before the weather found it. He wore a dark overcoat cut too well for that street, black leather gloves, and polished shoes that avoided the deepest puddles. His eyes moved calmly, but they did not soften when they landed on Mary. 2 men came out behind him. One was broad and thick-necked, with a shaved head and a tight mouth. The other was younger, lean, restless, and kept checking Ranger as if the dog might vanish if he looked away. Richard glanced at the items scattered near the porch, then at Frank. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I'm sorry this morning became unpleasant." Frank did not answer. Richard turned his face toward Mary. "Mary, you need to come with us." "No!" Mary's voice scraped once and stopped. Richard gave a small nod, as if the answer had been expected. "You have not been well since Daniel passed." Mary's hand slipped from Frank's jacket and caught the truck mirror instead. Her knuckles showed pale against the wet metal. Richard looked back to Frank. Her husband, Chief Petty Officer Daniel Collins, was a respected man, a SEAL, a good man. Since his death, Mary has struggled with decisions she no longer understands. He paused just long enough. Harbor Light has been helping her manage the estate. Frank's eyes shifted to Mary. She shook her head once. "He wanted nothing signed over," she said. "Not the house, not the insurance, not his retirement, not his Navy things." Richard's mouth curved gently. The smile did not reach his eyes. "That is exactly the confusion I mean." Mary looked at the curb. Rain dripped from her sleeve onto the concrete. She drew one breath through her nose and raised her head again. "He was hiding something from you." The younger man beside the SUV turned sharply toward Richard. The movement was quick, then checked. Frank saw it. Richard did not look at the younger man. "Mary, you are making this worse." The broad man stepped forward. "We can handle it, Mr. Vale." Ranger moved first. He did not bark. He only placed his front paws wider and lowered his head half an inch. The broad man stopped with one boot on the edge of the curb. Frank's right hand lifted from his side. 2 fingers, low, brief. Ranger held position. The young man's eyes dropped to Frank's hand, then to the ring on it, old gold, worn smooth at the edges. The trident caught a pale line of headlight in rain. The young man swallowed. "Wait," he said under his breath. "That's Little Creek Walker." Richard's face changed by almost nothing. Only his eyelids narrowed. Frank set the flag inside the open passenger door of the pickup. He did it carefully. His palm left a wet print on the plastic cover. Then he turned back. "Mary said no," Frank said. Richard tilted his head. "This is a family matter. Not yours." The broad man moved again, this time faster. He came around Ranger, reaching for Mary's arm. His shoulder brushed Frank's chest. Frank caught the wrist. There was no swing, no shove. His left foot shifted behind the man's boot. His right hand folded the wrist inward, and his forearm guided the elbow down. The broad man dropped to one knee with a grunt that ended hard in his throat. Frank held him there for 3 seconds. Ranger's eyes stayed on the younger man. The guard on the porch took one step back. Frank released the wrist. The broad man pulled his hand to his chest and stumbled away, breathing through his teeth. Richard removed one glove slowly and put it into his coat pocket. The gesture took longer than it needed to. His gaze stayed on Frank's face. "You have no idea what you have stepped into." Frank's jaw tightened once. His eyes went to the porch, to the scattered coat, to the broken toolbox, then back to Richard. I saw enough. Richard's smile faded. No. You saw an old house and a frightened widow. You have always been good at reacting to what stands in front of you. Mary took a small step closer to the truck. Richard looked past Frank toward the hood, where rain gathered in beads around the wet outline of the flag. Your father had the same habit. Frank did not move. Richard continued softly. Samuel Walker also thought Harbor Light needed to be challenged. Ranger's ears lifted. Richard opened the SUV door. He died in silence, too. The engine rose as Richard stepped back inside, and the black door closed softly behind him. The garage light died with a dry click just as Ranger stopped at the back wall. Frank stood still. Mary's hand was on the switch beside the door. She pressed it again. Nothing answered. The little garage went black except for the gray light leaking through the side window and the thin glow from Frank's pocket flashlight when he switched it on. Ranger did not move from the wall. The house near Ocean View had been too clean from the start. No loose mail, no coffee mug in the sink, no half-open drawer. A man's home usually kept some disorder after death, some small refusal to vanish. Daniel Collins's house had almost none. The rooms looked wiped down, straightened, and left behind by hands that had not loved anything in them. Frank moved the flashlight beam across the garage. Pegboard, tools, a workbench, paint cans lined up by size. The beam crossed a framed photograph on a shelf. Daniel in uniform, younger, shoulders square, eyes fixed forward. Mary stepped to it. She touched the frame once, then she took her hand away. He kept that one out here, she said. Said the house didn't need to salute him. Frank looked at the photograph, then at the floor beneath it. No dust line. The frame had been moved recently. His thumb tightened around the flashlight. He angled the beam lower. Ranger's nose hovered near the wall below the pegboard. He sniffed once, then stood back and looked at Frank. Frank crossed the garage. His boots made no sound on the painted concrete. He ran 2 fingers along the panel seam. The wood was smooth, but one section sat a fraction higher than the rest. Mary stepped closer. What is it? Frank did not answer. He pressed near the lower corner. Nothing happened. He pressed again, higher this time. A soft catch released inside the wall. The panel shifted outward half an inch. Mary stopped breathing for a beat. Frank pulled the panel open. Behind it was a narrow compartment, no wider than a rifle case. Inside sat a canvas pouch, a small notebook, a flat stack of papers wrapped in plastic, and a black external drive taped to the back. Frank set each item on the workbench in order. He did not rush. His hand stayed steady until he saw the first page. Mary Collins's signature sat at the bottom. Frank looked at Mary. She shook her head. I never signed that. The page was a transfer authorization. The next paper carried the same signature. So did the next. House, insurance, retirement account, personal effects. Frank laid them side by side, and the repeated name looked less like handwriting than a stamped mark. Mary picked up one sheet, set it down, picked it up again. Frank opened the notebook. Daniel's writing was tight and plain. Names, dates, phone numbers, small notes beside each line. Widow, Norfolk, house transferred, son contesting, Chesapeake, declared incompetent, medals missing, Virginia Beach, flag retained by Harbor Light. Frank stopped at a name 3 pages in, Samuel Walker. His thumb slid over the ink and held there. The flashlight beam tilted off the page and struck the concrete floor. For several seconds, the only sound was Ranger's slow breathing near the wall. Mary looked at him. Frank. He set the notebook flat again. The entry under Samuel's name was short. Cognitive review altered. Property surrendered. Personal military effects removed. Slate not recovered. Frank reached inside his jacket and took out the UDT dive slate. The old board looked dull under the flashlight. Scratches crossed the back in crooked lines. He had seen words in them before. Now he held it closer. The marks did not run at random. Some were shallow, some were deep. Some had been cut twice. Mary moved the flashlight closer. The scratches formed numbers, coordinates. Below them, almost hidden under the worn edge, were initials and dates. SW was first. Then 3 more names Frank had seen in Daniel's notebook. Older cases, earlier losses. Frank's jaw set. His palm shifted on the slate, leaving a wet mark from rainwater still trapped along the edge. He put the board beside Daniel's notebook. The 2 dead men had been writing the same warning from opposite ends of time. Mary opened the plastic-wrapped stack. The first photographs showed cardboard boxes on metal shelves. Each box had a number. Inside were medals, folded letters, old service photographs, burial flags in plastic sleeves. One image showed a brass plaque beside a table, Harbor Light Heritage Auction. Mary covered her mouth with her fingers. Frank turned the photographs over. On the back of one, Daniel had written 3 words in block letters. They sell memory. Frank placed the photo down. He did not look at Mary. His eyes stayed on the boxes, the flags, the medals laid out under clean auction lights. His right hand closed around the edge of the workbench until the tendons rose under the skin. Ranger lifted his head. The dog looked toward the house. Frank listened. Pipes, rain at the window, far traffic from the street, nothing else. Still, Ranger's ears stayed forward. Mary found the external drive under the plastic wrap. Daniel labeled it. Frank turned the flashlight toward it. A strip of white tape crossed the case. Written on it in black marker was one line: "If I die, start here." Mary carried it to the old laptop on the workbench. Her fingers missed the port once. Frank reached over and steadied the computer, not her hand. The screen woke slowly. A folder opened. Inside were scanned documents, photographs, audio files, and a video thumbnail showing Daniel seated at that same workbench. Mary clicked the first audio file. The laptop speaker crackled. Daniel Collins's voice filled the room. "Mary, if you're hearing this, my death was not an accident. Channel 16 is still open." The voice came from the small marine radio on the counter of the bait office. Frank checked the red light once, then looked down at the dive slate in his hand. The coordinates cut into the back had brought them to a storage shed at Little Creek Marina, 3 rows back from the slips, behind a chain-link fence and a line of empty crab pots. Mary stood beside the door with Daniel's notebook held against her coat. Ranger waited at Frank's left knee, nose lifted toward the seams in the shed wall. The lock on the storage unit was new. The door was old. Frank used the key taped inside the back cover of Daniel's notebook. It turned on the second try. Inside, the shed smelled of rope, fuel, and damp plywood. Frank's flashlight crossed metal shelves, cardboard cartons, plastic file tubs, and a blue duffel bag marked with Daniel Collins's initials. Mary made one sound, then pressed her lips shut. Frank set the dive slate on a crate and opened the first tub. Inside were folders, names, addresses, medical reviews, copies of power of attorney forms, a doctor's letter declaring a man incompetent, a lawyer's invoice, a bank record under Richard Vale's name, then photographs of auction tables lined with medals, letters, flags, and framed service pictures. Mary opened Daniel's duffel. Inside was a second drive, a paper ledger, and a sealed envelope marked Reyes. Beneath it sat a small digital recorder wrapped in a wool sock. Frank picked up the recorder. His thumb paused over the button. His palm had gone damp inside the glove. He put it beside the radio instead. The marina gravel popped under tires outside. Joe Bennett arrived first in an old station wagon. He was 70, wide in the chest, with a trimmed white beard and hands that still moved like they expected blood and bandages. A retired Navy corpsman, he carried a medical bag in one hand and said nothing when he saw Frank. He only nodded and stepped inside. Pete Harrison came next. He used a cane, but he planted it like a tool, not a weakness. His face was long, brown-spotted, and narrow, with pale eyes that stayed on the doors. He had been UDT before most people knew what the letters meant. He looked at the slate on the crate and touched 2 fingers to it. Detective Mark Reyes arrived in an unmarked sedan. He was in his early 40s, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair, tired eyes, and a clipped way of moving that saved time. He took Daniel's sealed envelope, opened it, and read the first page without speaking. "Is it enough?" Mary asked. Reyes looked at the shelves. "It is if it stays clean." Frank closed one file tub and pushed it toward him. "Then keep it clean." Headlights swept the fence. Ranger turned before anyone spoke. Frank lifted one hand. Joe shut off the office lamp. Pete moved to the side door. Mary tucked Daniel's notebook under her arm. Reyes slid the recorder into an evidence bag, then left it unsealed on the counter beside the running radio. Richard Vale walked through the gate with 3 men behind him. The broad one from Norfolk had his right wrist taped. The younger one stayed farther back this time. A third man carried a crowbar low at his side. Richard stopped 10 yards from the office. "You are making a public mistake." Frank stepped out onto the gravel. No one else moved. Richard looked toward the shed, then toward Mary. "Those materials belong to Harbor Light." Mary held the notebook tighter. "They belong to Daniel." Richard smiled. "Daniel is not here to correct you." Frank's fingers closed once around the edge of his jacket, then he let go. Richard turned back to him. "What are you going to do, old man? Call the Navy?" Frank did not answer. A pair of headlights come on at the end of the dock road, then another, then three more. Old pickups, a church van, Joe's station wagon, two cars parked behind the bait office. Light spread across the gravel, across Richard's coat, across the faces of people standing in rain jackets and worn ball caps. A widow from Chesapeake held a cardboard box against her chest. A retired machinist stood beside his son. Two neighbors from Ocean View stood near the fence. None of them stepped forward. None of them left. Richard's jaw shifted. The man with the crowbar moved toward the shed. Ranger crossed in front of him. The man stopped. Ranger's head turned toward a coil of dock lines stacked beside a fuel drum. He lowered his nose, sniffed once, then stiffened. Frank followed the line of his body. He crossed the gravel and pulled the coil aside. A handgun lay wrapped in a black rag beneath it. Reyes moved fast. "Back away!" The man with the crowbar lifted both hands. Richard looked at the gun, then at the radio through the office window. The red light was still on. Reyes picked up the weapon with a cloth and passed it to another officer who had come in behind the pickups. Then he took the recorder from the counter and sealed the bag. Richard's voice stayed low. "This will not reach a courtroom." Reyes held up the sealed evidence. It already started. Frank looked down at the slate on the crate through the open office door. His father's cut marks were visible under the overhead light. Beside it lay Daniel's ledger, the Reyes envelope, and the blue folder from the last file tub. Reyes opened the folder. His eyes stopped on the first page. At the bottom, beneath Richard Vale's signature, was the name of a sitting Norfolk judge. It was not supposed to reach a courtroom. Richard Vale entered the Norfolk courthouse with his coat buttoned, his lawyer beside him, and the same controlled smile he had worn at the marina. He did not look toward the benches. He did not look toward Mary. He looked once at Frank, then past him, as if an old man in a navy cap had become part of the furniture. Frank sat behind the prosecution table with Ranger at his feet. The dog was allowed there under quiet arrangement, away from the jury, still as a shadow beneath the bench. Frank's hands rested on his knees. His right thumb rubbed once across the worn edge of his trident ring, then stopped. Reyes stood near the aisle with the blue folder under one arm. When the rear door opened, Richard's smile held for 1 second too long. A federal investigator came in carrying the sealed envelope Daniel had left behind, the recorder from the marina, and the files from the storage shed. The room stayed quiet. Paper moved from hand to hand. The judge at the bench looked down at the first page and removed his glasses. Not the judge from the signature. That man was not on the bench anymore. The federal case opened in pieces, not speeches, documents, signatures, medical reviews, auction records, insurance transfers, the recorder from the marina. Richard's voice, low and clear, saying the evidence would never reach a courtroom. The paper ledger showed money moving from widows' estates into Harbor Light accounts, then into companies that had no workers, no office, and no real purpose except to hide the trail. Mary testified once. She kept both hands flat on the rail. Her voice did not rise. When Daniel's name came up, she looked at the floor for 3 seconds, then looked back at the attorney. Frank watched her hands. They did not shake. The doctor lost his license before Richard's trial ended. The lawyer who prepared the false transfers took a plea and named the accounts. The Norfolk judge whose signature sat in the blue folder resigned first, then was arrested 2 days later. His photograph ran in the paper without the robe. Richard did not change much when the verdict came. Fraud, coercion, forgery, money laundering, obstruction, charges tied to the events surrounding Daniel Collins's death. Guilty. His lawyer put a hand on the table. Richard kept his eyes forward. When the marshal stepped behind him, he finally turned toward Frank. Frank did not stand. Richard's hands went behind his back. The cuffs closed with a clean metal sound. Afterward came the slower work. Houses returned, accounts restored, court orders signed, boxes opened in a warehouse outside Norfolk, each one marked by number. Inside were medals, letters, folded flags, photographs, dog tags, navy caps, and old service ribbons wrapped in tissue. Some families came in person. Some sent children. Some sent no one because no one was left. Frank stood beside one table while a clerk opened a long cardboard box. His father's name was written on the inventory tag. Inside lay a photograph, a service Bible, 2 letters tied with brown string, and a brass UDT pin darkened at the edges. Frank touched nothing at first. His hand hovered above the box. Then he picked up the Bible and closed the lid with care. Mary's house was returned in spring. The papers came with stamps, signatures, and a new lock set in a small white bag. She stood on the porch with the key in her hand and did not step inside until Frank nodded once. The homecoming dinner happened that evening. It was not large. Joe Bennett brought a tray covered in foil. Pete Harrison sat near the window with his cane hooked over the chair. Reyes stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, reading the label on a pie box while Mary found plates. Neighbors came with bread, ham, green beans, and coffee strong enough to hold up a spoon. 2 widows brought photographs of men whose flags had been returned that week. Frank brought the folded flag from his father's house in a new glass case. He carried it in both hands. Mary had already hung Daniel's photograph on the wall near the dining room. Beneath it, there was an empty space. Frank set the flag there. No one spoke for a moment. Mary placed Daniel's notebook on the sideboard. Reyes set the sealed copy of the final court order beside it. Joe bowed his head. Pete removed his cap. Frank's jaw moved once, then settled. His left hand rested on the edge of the sideboard. The wood felt warm under his palm. Mary said a short prayer. When they ate, the room filled slowly with small sounds. Forks on plates, coffee poured, a chair leg scraping back. Ranger lay under the table near Mary's feet, his muzzle on his paws. He watched the room once, then closed his eyes. Later, Frank stood alone by the sideboard. The UDT dive slate lay beside the flag case. Its cut marks were clean now, no rainwater trapped inside them. Frank took the slate, turned it over, and set it flat beneath his father's photograph. Ranger shifted under the table, and the old slate stayed where Frank had placed it. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder, bright lights, or a voice from the sky. Sometimes they arrive through an old man who still knows how to stand his ground, through a loyal dog who sees danger before anyone else does, through a widow who finds the courage to speak after the world has tried to silence her. And maybe that is how God works in ordinary lives. He places the right person on the road at the right moment. He leaves a small sign where someone can still find it. A note, a photograph, a folded flag, a memory that refuses to die. And when evil believes the weak have been forgotten, God reminds the world that no honest life is ever too small to matter. In our daily lives, many people carry battles no one can see. Some are fighting for their homes. Some are grieving someone they loved. Some are simply trying to get through another quiet morning without losing hope. This story is a reminder that kindness still matters, courage still matters, and the truth may be delayed, but it is never buried forever. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe stories like this still matter, please subscribe to the channel and join us for the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, guide your steps, and bring peace to every home that needs light tonight.